I see a lot of these self-proclaimed white supremacist people like to talk about IQ and genetics as a metric to focus on. But let's ask ourselves, statistically, which race is reported to have the highest IQs on paper? It's the Asians, right? So that's one thing for white supremacists to consider, that white people aren't even statistically the smartest people, but we'll discuss some of the problems of looking at IQ statistics in comparison to genetics a little later on in this video. But first, here's another important thing to think about. Do you know who invented firearms? It's also the Asians, Chinese people to be more specific. So not only are Asians statistically smarter than white people, they also gave white people the tools that they needed to dominate and conquer others. Because no matter what your beliefs are, it should be pretty obvious that if white people didn't have guns, they wouldn't have been nearly as successful at taking over other people. And I'm not saying this to reprimand Asians, but for the topic of white supremacy and debunking it, it's an important thing to consider who gave them the tools they needed to succeed. And it was an Asian invention, the gun, that allowed Europeans to be dominant and conquer other people. The 400 years of slavery in America definitely wouldn't have happened if white people didn't have guns to keep their slaves under control. We should be able to understand that there is no way white people throughout history would have been dominant without guns. So, if you're a proud white supremacist, and if you're happy for how dominant white culture has been, then you have to thank Asians instead of boasting about being the best. Because white people wouldn't have been dominant without Asian help. Another big reason we see white people saying they're dominant is because of technology and mass industry, right? And they say that it's mostly white people who are responsible for creating all the most important technology in the world that we love, and all the mass industry that make our lives much easier and better. But do you know who taught the Europeans algebra? Algebra was taught to the Europeans by Arabic scientists. Yeah, and this is important because algebra is the core foundation for all forms of advanced mathematics that bring us all our favorite inventions. So, without the Arabs, Europeans wouldn't have learned algebra. And if the Europeans didn't learn algebra from the Arabs, then we wouldn't have all the inventions that we know and love today that white supremacists like to boast about. So that's something to think about. And see, just that fast, we already pointed out two non-white racial groups that white supremacists need to thank for helping them achieve this level of perceived dominance. If white people are truly the dominant supreme race, then why did they need help from other races to achieve their biggest endeavors, to achieve their biggest successes? It's because they are not as dominant as they want you to believe. And we'll see this more and more going further. But so far, white supremacists need to thank Asians and Arabs for giving them the tools they needed to be successful and prosperous throughout history. But of course they have a very hard time accepting that, because then the cracks in their belief system will start to be exposed. Yeah, it's because their racism has actually dumbed them down and made them blind. And people have a very hard time accepting when they're wrong about something. And here's another kicker. Check this out. If we're going to give white people the credit for industrialization, industrializing the world, then it's only fair and honest to give them the credit for all the bad things that industrialization causes too, right? So if we think about the fact that all the various forms of mass industrialization are the single biggest cause of cancer and sickness in the world, then that would mean white people have given more people cancer and made more people sick than any other race. Oof, that's a harsh reality that many people might not want to admit. But again, that's if we give white people the credit for industrialization all by themselves. So if you're a white supremacist who give white people the credit for industrialization around the world, are you sure you want to take that kind of credit? Do you want to take credit for being the world's largest spreaders of cancer? The credit for making more people sick than anyone else in history? Well, you can't. Even if you wanted to take credit for it, it would just be another case of stolen credit, because all the mass industry that we know and love today would not have been possible if the Arabs didn't teach the Europeans algebra. So let's stamp that to the front of our mind for now, and hopefully it helps you not feel any guilt if you're a white person. And for the record, I personally think it's very foolish to group all white people under the white category to say what they did and didn't do for society, especially since many white people throughout history had very opposing views from one another. Some white people supported industrialization, and many others were against it because they were die-hard environmental protection advocates. On a similar note, another reason it's so foolish and irrational to use inventors and innovators as the representation of all white people is because the average everyday white person is far from an innovator or inventor. And you can't take a small handful of rare, unique individuals and try to make them the example for billions of people, because the exception doesn't make the rule. That's incredibly dishonest. Most modern inventions are a collaborative effort from people of various races. But white supremacists are so evil and manipulative that they will ignore the invention and innovations of people from other races. Oh, and speaking of collaborative work, here's another important thing you should also consider. Asians also gave Italians the foundations that they needed to create pizza and pasta. So two of the greatest European foods were invented by Asians. Imagine that. You know that Italian food is a lot of people's favorite food, right? Do you know why? Mainly because of pizza and pasta. And I'm going to do a whole other video on the Asian influence in European culture and how the Asians actually helped the Europeans become more civilized and progressive, because it seems like these are things most people don't know about today. So I think a video has to be done on it to remind people of the effort that Asians put into helping Europeans. Look out for that video too. Pizza, pasta, and guns. The Asian influence on European culture. But what you should be starting to see is that to be a white supremacist, you have to either be ungrateful to the other races that helped white people throughout history, or just be lacking in historical knowledge. Which most people are, by the way. That's not something to be ashamed of. History is very long, dense, and complicated. But hopefully I can provide even a little bit of clarity and insight with this video. Let's talk a little bit more about Asians having the highest IQs, because I see IQ as a big talking point for a lot of white supremacists. Now, why do you think Asians are so smart? Do you think it's something special in their genetics or blood that make them smarter than everyone else? Think about this. Do you see Asians going around saying, "I'm smart because I'm Asian"? No, they actually don't do that. Unless they do it in a joking or ironic way, because in my experience with Asians, they tend not to think that way. If you tell an Asian person they're smart because they're Asian, they're either gonna laugh it off, play along, or look at you like you're stupid or ignore you. So really think about that. The actual statistically smart people, the Asians, they don't go around saying, "I'm smart because I'm Asian." It's only the foolish and ignorant people who say things like that because they don't understand it's actually the Asian culture and lifestyle that makes them smart, not their genetics. Let me explain to you why it's extremely foolish to say that Asian people are smart just because they're Asian, as if they have some special genetics in them that make them smarter. If you were to take a smart Asian person with a high IQ and put their life under a microscope to examine how they live, you won't see that person just sitting around doing nothing saying, "I'm smart because I'm Asian." No, what you will see is that person putting in work and effort to become smarter and doing things that help their mental development, such as studying, reading, playing instruments, and even sports. Because these are all things that help your mental development and boosts your IQ. IQ isn't something stagnant that doesn't change. It can be improved through certain practices and exercises. Have you ever heard of something called a tiger parent? A tiger parent is a phrase that is very common in Asian culture. It's a parent who pushes their children to achieve high levels of academic success and excellence. And they do it through very strict and rigorous control methods and discipline, and pretty much non-stop studying. They put academic success and achievement above their own personal happiness in a way that many people might call abusive or a little too demanding. But tiger parents are actually very common in the Asian culture, and this is the big factor in their lifestyle and culture that determines their IQ level. This is what makes them so smart, the guidance and leadership of parents who want them to succeed. So what all this means is that a high IQ is not something natural that you're just born with simply because you have smart parents. If all you had to do to be smart was have smart parents, then Asians wouldn't go so hard on their kids making sure they study so much with rigorous education schedules. They would just sit there and say, hey, you're Asian, you'll be smart, don't worry. But no, they understand that IQ can be built and developed. So there's another strike against white supremacists because clearly Asian culture is superior to white culture, at least when it comes to producing a smart, high IQ child. But what if you came from a lifestyle and culture that is the complete opposite of the Asian culture? And instead of putting things like studying and reading on a pedestal, you thought it was a waste of time, and you didn't see the value in schoolwork. And you were around people who teased and made fun of smart people, calling them nerds, teachers' pets, or whatever insult. And even your parents were the complete opposite of Asian parents. You're most likely going to have a lower score because you didn't fully develop your intellectual capabilities. And if you didn't know, IQ tests are actually very biased and skewed because you can actually study for an IQ test to get a higher score. And with that in mind, it's sad and ridiculous that I see a lot of people these days trying to promote this idea that IQ is a heritable trait, as if smarts are just automatically passed down. And you have to be a real fool to believe that if you're a smart person, then your kids are just automatically going to be smart too, without any outside influences from their environmental factors. We need to remember that the environment you grow up in is a far greater determining factor of IQ level than your genetics. The reason why Asian parents are so strict with studying and schoolwork is because they understand that having a high IQ and being smart is something that can be developed and earned. And with this in mind, you know what else is sad? These people who say things like Asians are smart because of their genetics are so foolish that they don't realize this belief can keep people in a low state of mind and a low state of success. Let me explain a little more. If I have it in my mind that Asians are just naturally smarter because they're Asian, as if it's their Asian blood that makes them smart, then if I'm someone who is not Asian, I would be less motivated to try to be as smart as them, which could then lead to me putting in less effort when it comes to schoolwork and studying, because if I have it in my mind that Asians have an unfair advantage, why should I even try to be as smart as them? See, this mindset can lead to feelings of self-doubt and inadequacy. But if I have it in my mind that Asians are smart because of the effort that they put into studying, and if I understand that it's their culture and lifestyle that make them smart, then I would be more motivated to study the way that they do. And I might be more inclined to adopt things from their culture and lifestyle that make them smart. So genetics and blood are not what determine how smart you are. It's your lifestyle and culture. That is what's truly heritable. I'm going to do another in-depth video on this topic too, where I go into all the factors that can make a person higher IQ. So look out for the video on the recipe for a high IQ. But for now, let's get back to the main point and let's talk about white inventions and innovation. I notice a lot of these white supremacist types like to take pride in the fact that white people are responsible for a lot of invention and innovation. As I mentioned earlier, Europeans learned algebra from Arab scientists. But let's pretend they didn't. Let's just pretend that algebra was created by some European guy for a moment. We then have to ask ourselves, throughout history, was the average everyday white man an inventor or innovator? No, he was not. The number of inventors and innovators are incredibly small in comparison to the billions and billions of white people who are not inventors and far from innovators. So it's actually incredibly sad, weak, and pathetic to look at the success of greater men than you and take credit for their accomplishments just because you share the same skin color, especially if you haven't achieved anything great yourself. White supremacists are proud of living in the shadow of better people than they are. Does that sound like someone who is great and dominant? Someone who claims the success of another man? No. It's actually the opposite of great and dominant to be comfortable living in another person's shadow. True greatness requires effort, not entitlement. The white supremacist form of greatness is actually a lazy and low effort form of greatness to say, I'm great because I'm white, when white skin is not even something you can control. And this way of thinking truly makes me sick because I just find it very pathetic to take credit for another man's accomplishments, for another man's achievements just because you share the same skin color and I put no effort into my skin color. These people are so blinded and dumbed down by their racism that they don't even realize they're lowering the bar on greatness when you try to claim another person's achievements and you haven't even done anything great yourself except I was born with white skin and that's my greatness. It's sad. That's low effort, low bar greatness. To not achieve anything but be born with something you can't even control. So you could just sit there and be white and then call yourself great for being born white. It's just so pathetic and dishonest. The dishonest part is that white supremacists don't like to look at white people who are considered failures or those who are unaccomplished. They don't look at those people as an example of whiteness. They only look at the very few who are successful or famous, to try to make them the representations for all white people, even though they're extremely rare. We cannot use a rare and unique example to try to represent the larger group of people. That's just very dishonest. Have you ever seen a black person who thought they could fight or play basketball just because they're black? Even though he couldn't fight? Even though he sucked at sports? Yeah, it's incredibly pathetic to take credit from people who can do those things and say you're on the same level as them just because you're black. And we see a very similar thing with these white supremacist types who have to lie to themselves to say that they're great just because they're white. And these views are extremely evil because I see people using white supremacist talking points to justify mistreatment towards other races as if they're less than human. And these views are extremely evil because I see people using white supremacist talking points to try to justify mistreatment towards other races as if they're less than human because they're not white. This is honestly my biggest problem with white supremacists. Their messaging promotes hatred and violence against other races and then try to justify the violence by dehumanizing people and claiming they are less than deserving of basic rights. They also seem to not realize how easy it is for other white people to come in and just use them as puppets and pawns for their own personal agendas. Because it's easy to manipulate a person who is narrow-minded. All you have to do is be white, say what they say, and you'll gain their trust. And now, let's discuss the magnum opus, the crown jewel of all white accomplishment, America. Or at least, there seem to be many people who try to portray America as a great white creation that was built by white people only. Okay, let's think about that. First off, did you know that more than half of the states in America are named after Native American tribes? Yeah. 26 out of the 50 states in America are named after Native American tribes, including Alabama, Mississippi, and even Texas. So more than half of America isn't even named after white people or white things. Wow, that's interesting and kind of funny to me. Because you'd assume a supposed white country built by white people for white people wouldn't have named half of their country after something that isn't even white, like Native American tribes. And what about the Asians that built railroads in America during the 1800s? Were railroads important for the growth and development of America? Yeah, I'm pretty sure they were very important for the growth and development of America. The railroads that Asians built helped to connect the East and the West of America, and this led to a lot of economic opportunity and growth. So it's not irrational to say that Asians had a strong hand in the development and growth of America. And what about the African slaves taken to America? Were they white or black? They were black, right? And what were they used for? Did they kind of just stand around doing nothing, or did they help build America? Yeah, I'm pretty sure black slaves also had a significant influence on the development of America, because guess what? Having a free labor force is substantial for building any country. And let's be clear about something. America wouldn't be half as powerful as it is today without a strong slave labor force, because the money generated from slavery helped to finance the development of many American industries that fueled the nation. Another important thing to keep in mind is that when we think about slavery, we typically only have this picture of slaves working on farms. But black slaves in America didn't only work on farms and plantations. A lot of black slaves were used to build roads, railroads, ports, and buildings. So we can say that black people also had a very significant hand in the building and development of the infrastructure of America. Remember earlier when I mentioned that you need to be ungrateful or dishonest to be a white supremacist? Yeah, you can see the same trend continue here as we discuss the actual development and growth of America. Because white supremacists have to ignore historical facts to hold on to their beliefs. With all this in mind, you have to be incredibly dumb or dishonest to still believe that America was only built by white people without any outside help. But if you're an honest person with reasonable intelligence, you don't even have to be that smart. Just have basic intelligence, and you should start seeing cracks in these ideas of white supremacy. This is the last thing I want you to think about for now. If you consider all the information I gave you and still hold white supremacist views, then you may be low IQ. Because an aspect of having high IQ is being able to make advanced connections with complicated information, and everything I laid out wasn't complicated. It was actually all fairly simple and basic. So if you can't even accept and acknowledge the basic fundamental facts about history, then that's a problem you need to address. Either you're a low IQ or you're just so blinded by racism that you can't accept any information that goes against your beliefs. Before you leave, keep in mind, the only supreme race is the human race. And no matter where you're from, we all have the same origins that draw back to the same place, and we all have the same common ancestor. Never forget that. If you do, you can lose your understanding of humanity. Remember to subscribe and check out my other videos too. I got a lot of content debunking a lot of other lies and false viewpoints you commonly hear in society today. And if you disagree with anything I said, let me know in the comments. I'm not so close-minded that I will reject criticism or new thoughts.